Megan, Beyond Meat is one of the ones that I enjoy talking with the crew, your guys' crew from LikeFolio, because this is one where we can actually see, what is the perception around the quality of the product, the excitement around the trends that are going from meat to kind of the artificial alternatives to meat, and of course, are they actually buying Beyond? So those are all the questions, and we're hoping that you have the answer.
Awesome. So yeah, we like to look at Beyond Meat too, because there are so many different ways that you can kind of approach this from a trend perspective, but also from a consumer demand perspective for the product itself. And so when we listen to consumers talking about Beyond Meat, we're listening for them purchasing Beyond Meat or consuming Beyond Meat, whether that's from a grocery store or from one of the food service partners that they have. So maybe in a restaurant, an actual menu item. And what you can see on this chart, this green line is that purchase intent, that demand I talked about. And this is both of those mentions, those food service and those retail mentions. And you can see that we have this trending down about 52% year over year. And I think that, there is an element of hype in this, and that this was such, this time last year, this was still a really novel product, and a lot of people were talking about it. And so there's kind of some normalization there. However, we do see a decrease in demand, through March, and just overall that demand is trending lower. So we don't segment in that we don't really pull out, this is retail versus this is food service. So I think that it's normal that this would have some year-over-year decline, because a lot of these restaurants just aren't getting the traction that they were prior to quarantine as people are, staying in. So I think the real question is, will the retail side of things be able to make up for that lack of food service purchases? And so far, our data does not look extremely strong for Beyond Meat.
Megan, you just basically discussed the exact question that I was going to ask, which is the, the value or the coolness, the newness of Beyond Meat starting to wear off? And are they a victim of that demand starting to wane? Or is this a coronavirus issue that maybe they can bounce back from? Is there any way your data can be broken down to that? Because we all kind of thought that the excitement over Beyond Meat would slow down in terms of the fevered pitch that it was at. But I'd like to know, if I could, what's the bigger effect on Beyond Meat? Just an overall, people tried it and decided to go back to meat, or is this a coronavirus effect?
I think that there's a little bit of both of the things that you described going on with Beyond Meat. I think that there was a surge for people to try this because it was so new right at first. And now we're seeing things kind of settle in. There was a decrease at the onset of this quarantine. And I think Beyond Meat even indicated that they did see sales kind of taper off at the end of March. And, we see that when we look at these diet trend mentions. So one diet trend that we track in particular is plant-based. And from a year-over-year perspective, we're starting to see some normalization in the last 30 days. I think that plant-based diet mentions are up about 22% in the last 30 days versus the prior year. But you can see that sharp decline through March and April, right at the onset of COVID, as people, I think, just weren't necessarily, that wasn't a priority at the time. And so we're seeing that start to return, and that definitely is something that is increasingly prevalent in our data. Some of the other diets that are gaining steam from a year-over-year perspective are the flexitarian diet. So people who, are incorporating more plant-based products, but maybe not solely plant-based, and also just high protein in general. So I think that there is this valuation of protein from consumers, and consumers are increasingly open to some plant-based options. But from an overall demand perspective, it's definitely just of late trending down for Beyond Meat.
Yeah, and I think undeniably, you guys both hit on it, Megan. The hype factor was great marketing. It made, Beyond Meat a household name in this space, but it was unsustainable in terms of the excitement around the brand. They just had to hope that they, maintain some of that, product, loyalty, if you will, going forward. But from what I could see on that chart, at least from when you were first starting to track the consumer purchase intent data to where we are now, it has settled in at a higher number, even though it's trending downward. And then the other question I would have, I guess, is, Megan, is this a seasonal component to this as well? Do you see more kind of talking about dieting in certain months versus others? Are we in a down part of that seasonal trend, or is this where things should be upticking?
Yeah, there's definitely a seasonal component to this. And I think that's why you see that big peak at the end of 2020. That's the New Year's resolutions. That's when people are talking about the different modifications that they're making to their diet. So this is definitely a trend that is showing year-over-year growth. And so I think that's important to note because there is a seasonal component to this. Another thing that you keyed in on was, loyalty. And from a sentiment perspective for Beyond Meat, that's something we haven't touched on yet. Sentiment is pretty high. So for people who are actually buying Beyond Meat, I think the consumer happiness is about 80% positive. Comparatively, I think its closest peer, I would say, is Impossible Foods, and they're sitting around 75% positive. So definitely a leader in sentiment and also just a leader in overall volume. So we track dozens of different plant-based brands, and from a volume perspective of just people talking about a brand, Beyond Meat is definitely receives the most mentions.
So, Kevin, what I'm hearing is it's a trend in the right direction for this style of diet, which is a good thing. They're the leader in the space, at least in terms of loyalty, happiness around the brand, and kind of the hype around the brand. The big thing is, though, is it's still a premium product. It's still something that's going to require, a change in activity for the consumer. So getting new people to adopt this is going to require them to change what they've done for a long time in most cases. And it's in a time of uncertainty in the economy. Is this really the time for the majority of Americans to be adopting a new diet, a new premium price point product when they're not sure if they're going to be working?
Right. And Alex, two things, right? Adding to that. Number one, people would like to know, is there a significant health benefit to this, right? Is this significantly more healthy than, let's say, regular chicken or regular beef? And the other thing that people are probably very sensitive to is price. If it's got to be priced competitively to go up against these names. I mean, if it's marginally better or equal and it costs 10 or 20 or 30% more, that right there will zap some of the demand after some of the novelty wears off. So they've got some things they have to work through, that's for sure. But, data that says it's more healthy and the price component are two big things that I would consider, frankly.
Kevin, one thing this reminds me of that you've talked about often is when you referred to when oil was really expensive in the 2000s and the hybrid car. And so it might be a solution, but is it really a solution if it costs more still? And that's still the answer and question for this particular space too. Is that a comparison you think is fair?
Exactly. I mean, if you're going to make my life better like a hybrid car would, the example that I used for the people watching the show was I went out to look at like a hybrid car during when the gas prices were high, but it was like $10,000 or $15,000 more than the regular car. Well, it's a great idea, but I can buy a lot of gas with that $10,000. And this is a great idea to make plant-based meat. But if it's 30% more or 20% more, I can buy a lot of chicken with that 20%. So it's gotta compete on a price level because this is basically you're trying to get into the consumer staple business, and that has to compete on price. The margins are already very tight in that department. So you've got to compete maybe a little better than they are right now, frankly.
Megan, I think this has always been seen as a long-term story, kind of the sustainability around if they're able to figure this out, it's going to be easier to, mass produce at scale at some point. Obviously a long ways away. It's still a premium price point product. But one thing is for those who are considering an investment or a trade in this type of a name is the trade has really stabilized in this way. It's not as crazy as it was a year ago in terms of the price movement. And you've had a lot more data to track around the price movement as well. Do you guys have a feel one direction or another going into this earnings or long term?
Whenever we look at this, there's no denying that purchase intent drop off. That's hard for us to not consider that we do see demand waning. But I think that it's really, really difficult to bet against a name like this. I think that there's a lot of short interest in Beyond. So from an earnings perspective, that could be a little bit more volatile. But, this is something that we'll continue to watch. We do like that there are tailwinds, like these different diet trends that are kind of propelling or helping to propel consumers to consider this. But as Kevin mentioned, the price point is a big factor for consumers who are talking about whether they're buying this or other meat. But I think that that's something we'll continue to watch long term. From a sentiment perspective, we really like that Beyond Meat consumers are happy with the product. But from a demand perspective, that drop off that we're seeing is a little bit concerning.